Professor Lugovsky, it's great to see you today.
It's very nice seeing you too, Jason.
So, Professor, you're teaching at Indiana University economics. And at the Department of Economics, you look at a lot of things, including what's going on in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And what I've seen in the last few days is that things aren't looking like they're doing particularly well in the Russian economy. What have you seen?
So things have been not going well for Russian economy for a long time. If you are talking about the latest events, right? So this threat of new sanctions. So Senator Lindsey behind those, advocating those, right? So Russian economy took it very seriously, right? So if you think about the major companies, so they all lost between 2 and 4% of their value within a day. Right, so we're talking about oil company, we are talking about gas companies, we are talking about metal companies, we are talking about the tanker fleet companies, right? So all of these companies, which are the major source of Russian revenues from exporting, right? So they actually take them very seriously. And even before sanctions were announced, just the threat of some sanctions might be announced, force them to lose a lot of money. Right. So why is it the case? Because so these sanctions will be targeting not just Russian individuals, Russian companies directly. They will be targeting the consumers of Russian products, right? So they will be targeting all over the world companies and countries which are buying Russian oil, gas, and other types of Russian goods, right? And so this might be potentially very effective. And so they realize that, and so that's why the stock of those companies have dropped. And many of these companies are already incurring losses. Many of these companies are already incurring losses, even because of other events, such as a decrease in price of energy, oil in particular, right? So we see that the supply by Saudi Arabia has increased significantly. We see also that US supply might also increase. So Goldman Sachs projected that the Brent oil will be priced at $56 a barrel next year. So meaning that Russian oil will be priced even lower because A, that's a lower quality oil. Two, countries which are now buying Russian oil, they force Russia to sell at discount, right? So if you think about China, if you think about India, right? So Russia sells at a discount, does not always get payment in currency, sometimes get payments in goods, right? And so Russia definitely needs money to finance war, right? So it needs to finance war with its own population. And recently we also see that they're not able to sustain war effort just themselves. So for example, to fight Ukrainians in Russian territory in Kursk Oblast, they had to employ North Koreans. They're obviously paying them something in return. For Iranian equipment and technologies, they have to pay them probably with nuclear technology and with uranium. And obviously, China is not selling them goods for free, so they also have to pay to China, right? And so all of these factors are gradually collapsing Russian economy.
So that sounds like things are not going so well for the Russians. But let me ask you another question. I just saw a news article that the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is like the police in Russia, is considering making it illegal to give out personal loans. That is, they would make it illegal for Russian banks to give out personal loans. Now, I don't think it's completely by coincidence that just 2 days before, a big news story came out saying that about 2 million Russians, of about 28 million Russians, decided they were no longer going to pay back their credit card debt. That is, they just told the banks, sorry, we're not going to be sending the money for what we charged. Do you think those things are related? And what could this indicate? Perhaps it's a sign of liquidity problems?
There are already now liquidity problems in Russia. And so this measure, if implemented, and from what I hear, that has been among the central news in Russia, right? So will create even stronger liquidity problem, right? So what Russia is trying to do really hard is it's trying to preserve its appearances in the world as if they can sustain the war effort for years to come, right? So they have bombarded Ukraine with a unprecedented number of missiles and drones, right? And they report the inflation to be maybe just 10%. And so they do all kinds of generating statistics, which would be creating this feeling as if things are not that bad in Russia and maybe even going well, right? And so they spend a lot of money and effort to manufacture these numbers and to keep these numbers afloat for international audience. But like very simple analysis of even Russian statistics will show the discrepancy, right? So for example, we have the official inflation rate is 10%, but the central bank interest rate is over 20%, right? So how is it sustainable? If you look at financing rates which currently commercial banks offer to Russian population, so they vary between 25 and 50%. So think about it, 50% for personal loan for the Russian population, right? So that's extremely high. And so I think what happens is that, so they have this kind of like different bureaucratic entities. And so each of these entities has its own goal based on which it's evaluated. So if you think about central bank, so they need to maintain inflation law, right? And so they are like doing all kinds of things to maintain inflation law. And then if you think about Russian police, right? So they want to avoid some kind of massive unrest, and also they maybe want to have these banks, the Russian economy in general wants to have banks afloat. So now if 2 million people have decided not to pay credit card loans, if you start enforcing them, right? So you're gonna have potentially social unrest because that's a large proportion of economically active Russian population, right? If you allow these loans and they will accelerate even further the spiral, so we can expect maybe higher inflation rate, and so we can expect that these heads of these bureaucratic entities will not be happy. And so they found this very simple solution. So we just prohibit consumer loans. This way, we're going to be decreasing demand for money. And this way, we will not be also have unhappy consumers who cannot pay their loans and unhappy banks, which are losing money because consumers are not paying loans, right? And so it seems to be like maybe in somebody's head smart solution, but what you're doing, you're killing the ability to finance all these day-to-day needs, right? So you're creating a huge liquidity problem that when your car breaks and you cannot fix it, then you cannot go to work or you cannot do any other like business or personal activities. And so the whole thing stops. And so this will simultaneously stop for many, many, many Russians. And especially in the regions, right? So where the level of income is much lower than in centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow, right? So this is going to generate huge problems. So if they were to implement this measure, very soon it will backfire with this massive liquidity problem and with even bigger problems for Russian economy and for its population.
So, despite all those signs, a lot of people say, look, the Russian economy is doing fine. Actually, just yesterday, Russia announced it has one of the largest economies in the world. It continues to grow quickly. But how much of that's attributable to what's going on with the military industrial complex? And what does that mean really for the Russian economy?
Yes, I have seen that news that Russia has self-announced itself as being the fourth largest economy in the world, right? And so that's laughable. And so maybe it also shows a sign of desperation, and so they need to feed these stories to Russian population, right? And even before, right? So they were managing to put these numbers, and so these numbers were then recited by, for example, World Bank and some other world organizations. And so what they're doing, they're effectively selling the expenditures on military complex as the same part of GDP as everything else, right? And so in many countries which are not at war, this might be indeed the case, right? So if you're building a tank in the United States, right? So this tank will be working to project military strengths for the United States for decades to come, right? And so the depreciation rate is very low. And so depreciation rate is comparable to usual durable goods, usual infrastructure expenditures when you build a bridge, when you build an airplane, when you build a train or a car, right? So we expect these goods and infrastructure to serve for maybe 10, 15, 20, or maybe 40 or 50 years, right? With the case of Russian military expenditures, if you build a tank and you declare that its value, the market value is $5 million because you managed to sell very few of those to some other countries, but the life expectancy of this tank is maybe just a month or 2 or 3. And so after that, it's destroyed. And so depreciation rate is extremely high. And so that's why these are expenditures which Russia is trying to really hard sell as a part of normal GDP. But this is a part of GDP which will be destroyed almost immediately. And so that's why it just basically wasted money from the economic point of view, from the point of view of how Russian economy will be operating.
So Russia, though, has, it seems like, very few options because with China and its own serious economic problems, it's unlikely to bail it out. And Russia might rely again on just printing more money or on something they've been talking a lot about recently, which is e-rubles, electronic rubles that they would use to pay things. Well, what does this all mean for the Russian economy?
It will mean that the ability of Russian economy to function with just ruble circulation will be greatly diminished because there will be hyperinflation. So what happens during hyperinflation, as soon as you get this currency, in Russian case it's rubles, you're trying to do two things. A, to spend it as fast as you can on the goods which you'll be able to consume immediately. And two, to convert them into some other currency, right? So dollars, euros, yuans, right? So and that basically creates this already inflationary process will be self reinforcing itself because nobody wants to keep rubles. Everybody wants to get rid of them as soon as you get them, right? And so at that stage, it's very difficult to stop. And so bad part of the hyperinflation is that A, you need to print as fast as you can, and two, forget about any midterm or long-term investments because all of these will be eaten like in a month or two with interest rate and with new prices. So everybody will be just thinking about very short horizons, right? And so that's, again, very bad side for the economy.
Sure enough, about half the Russian budget goes to defense or military related expenses. But why is that different? If you spend, let's say, 5 million bucks building a tank, how's that different than spending 5 million bucks on building infrastructure or another government expense?
This might be not as different if you have a country in the, at the time of peace. And so you're making all these expenditures to build up military potential to deter potential threats from foreign countries. But if you're at war, right, so then all of these tanks and all of these other type of military expenditures, so they will be expendable, and so they will have very short lifetime, right? So the depreciation rate of these type of equipments will be very short. And so in this case, you'd be replenishing the same thing over and over again, right? So it's basically as if you're throwing money and then you need to throw again money because these tanks are destroyed and then you build new tanks and then again and again and again, right? And so that creates a problem. So the second part of that is, of course, the pricing of the military equipment is completely based on Russian government decisions on how to price them. And so they will keep telling that all these tanks are worth $5 million. And so this way they'd be able to, again, inflate their GDP for international community to see, to basically send a signal, look, our GDP is not as low as you were expecting. Why? Because we are producing all these tanks. And then somehow many people don't ask the question, what happens with those tanks? And the answer with those tanks, they will be burned within a month or two.
So overall, what options does Russia have? How can it continue going forward with these problems? Why is printing money probably not a good option? It looks like so far Russia's kept inflation relatively stable. Keep in mind, the ruble was bouncing to say $1 to 130, but now it's down to $1 to 80. Why is that?
Well, to some extent, it's because it's not market value, right? So you cannot, as a Russian citizen, you cannot buy all these dollars as much as you want and transfer them to foreign country, right? So all of these transactions are extremely difficult. And then you have this kind of not exactly like Soviet Union, but close to that, right? So Soviet Union for decades had the exchange rate of 61 cents of Soviet cents per dollar, right? Even though in reality it was like 10, 20, 30 times higher than that. And so you can maintain that with administrative measures, but it hardly speaks about the ability of, buy as many dollars as you want at this price. And so that's why I wouldn't pay that much attention also to the exchange rate. And so that's, again, another way. So for Russian populations, the exchange rate is very important. And so most of the Russian population doesn't care about the ability to buy even, let's say, $10,000 and to spend them abroad, right? So just because they don't have money for that. And so they just see that for whatever $100 they're allowed to buy, or a few $100 they're allowed to buy, they would have money to buy, and then they will kind of use it as a means of savings. And second, it again inflates Russian GDP in terms of dollars, right? So because international community cares about Russian GDP in dollar value, and so they would just manipulate the exchange rate, and this way automatically manipulate their own GDP.
Got it. So let me ask you one last question. Russia right now is facing the US sanctions, which we mentioned earlier. Now, these sanctions, introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham, would put 500% tariffs on goods being imported from countries to the United States, from countries that are buying Russian oil, Russian gas, uranium, and other things. Now, China as well as India combined make up about 80-85% of all Russian oil purchases. Oil itself, as you're aware, is more than 35% of the Russian national budget. How significant would these sanctions be for the Russian economy?
So I think if implemented, the effect will be very pronounced. So in US, there are many people who are very interested that if sanctions are implemented, they to be effective. So we can expect the higher level of enforcement of these sanctions, which is very important, right? So not just to announce sanctions, but also to enforce them. So Russia depends hugely on exports of its energy. And so if it cannot export energy, it cannot buy much from abroad because it wouldn't just have revenue to do that. And the modern war, you cannot just fight with soldiers, right? So you need to have sophisticated ammunition for that. So you cannot also buy that and abroad. And so that potentially will, have a crippling effect on Russian economy and also on its ability to wage this war.
So, going ahead, one last question. Would you say that you're bullish or bearish on the Russian economy?
I cannot think of anybody who would be these days bullish about Russian economy, except for people who are paid to claim that they're bullish about Russian economy. So I'm definitely bearish, and I think the majority of international economists and observers are very bearish about Russian economy, including Russians themselves, right? So their stocks are falling in one day for some companies between 2 and 4% of their major companies. So they're like leading companies, right? So it means that Russian society, right? So Russian economy is actually bearish about Russian economy.
That's excellent. We can only hope that it collapses sometime soon. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. It was very nice seeing you.